Okay, we might make a start. Good morning, all. My name is Wally Dethlefs, and I'm the Director of Youth Affairs Network of Queensland, known also as YANC. I'd like to kickstart this forum by acknowledging that we live on unceded Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respect and acknowledge the wisdom of elders past and present. I also would like to acknowledge the wisdom and tenacity of other elders who have been fighting injustice and showing us the way to work towards creating a better society for all. And of course, I'm not talking about a very young guest today, who will introduce to you very shortly. Today, we have the privilege of talking with Wally Dethlefs, who has arguably had the most influence on the youth sector in Queensland, and both directly and indirectly has touched the lives of thousands of the most marginalized young people in our society. We're here to celebrate his achievements and to have an informal discussion with him and hopefully take away with us some of the practice wisdoms that he has accumulated during his 50 year or so working with young people. I've had the pleasure of knowing Wally personally for the past 20 years or so. He's been an inspiration, a mentor, a comrade, a friend. His passion for justice combined with his unparalleled sense of humor and the most refined use of sarcasm has made some of the most tedious meetings in youth justice that I have attended somewhat bearable. And you probably will come across some of this humor and probably some of also his sarcasm today as he talks. I will start the forum with asking a few questions from Wally to warm us up and then open up to interaction and questions from participants. I also know that there are some participants who have known Wally for a long time and have worked with him in various settings. If you have any stories about Wally and his work, we would really love if you can share it with us today. So let's begin. Thank you, Wally, for accepting to attend this forum and occupying the hot seat.
And it is a hot seat too. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I'd like us to think about those young people who are in detention at the moment, and particularly our Aboriginal sisters and brothers who are in detention either here in Brisbane or up north. And thank you for your kind words. I think Confucius says, beware of him whose words far outweigh his deeds.
Are you telling people to beware of me?
No, me.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Wally, I'll start by asking you something. I've always been curious, but I've never asked you. Can you tell us a little bit about your own childhood and teenage years? And were you always a troublemaker?
I can't answer that question, Siavash, because my lawyer is not present. So we might hold that over. But one of my teachers, when I was in primary school, said that I was wild. And another one whom I loved dearly said to my parents that I was boisterous but not wild. So I think that means that somehow or other I was spirited. And so if I can get away with that, I'm happy.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, no, that's good. You are definitely spirited. So when and how did it come about that you began working with homeless young people?
Well, as many of you know, I'm a Catholic priest, and in the first parish I was in, because there were two priests, one was the elder man and in charge, and I was younger, I was given the responsibility of working with the young people. And I found out that about 6 of those young people had parent or parents who are alcoholics. And so there was the usual violence and dehumanization that went on in their homes. And I had, during my seminary time, I had heard a tape where this man said that he thought that 1 in 4 Australians had a problem with alcohol. And I thought I could meet one of those 4 at some stage of my life. And so I read whatever I could get about Alcoholics Anonymous and its program, its 12-step program. And there was no Alateen available in Brisbane at the time. So I used to take them to an Al-Anon group, which was for parents or partners of people who are alcoholics. And so that's how I started getting into working with disadvantaged young people. And I also remember meeting a young man, and I said, I haven't met you before. And he said, I've been away. And I said, where have you been? And he'd been put in Westbrook, which was a detention centre up on the Darling Downs. And I had difficulty in talking with him because I had had no experience of young people who had been locked up. But so from then on, in the work that I was doing, I was on the lookout for young people who were struggling due to problems or to situations that that they had no power over, or very little.
Yeah. And what about the lodge? How did that come about?
Well, I was made chaplain to an organisation called Young Christian Students that was in most Catholic schools in Brisbane and in a couple of Catholic parishes and a few state high schools as well. And my job was to try, this organisation had a wonderful methodology that they call See, Judge and Act. And I could talk about that till the cows come home. But it was a good methodology. It was a good way of approaching difficult situations. You would see and talk about what you were seeing and how it affected you or how it affected the people that it was impacting upon. And then you would make a judgment. Is this right? Is this wrong? How can this situation be improved? How can the people who are in this situation take some action to improve this? And so that's where the ACT came in. And then at the next meeting the following week, you would again review that. How did the action go? Which was, it became another C, SEE. And then you do another judgment, and you were constantly deepening your understanding of whatever the problem was. And so I had that job, and a mate of mine, a priest friend of mine, he had the job of working across Brisbane with YCW, which was Young Christian Workers, who also operated the same way under the same principles. And this other priest, Pat Tynan, and myself, we were coming in for a lot of criticism from a lot of people who felt that we shouldn't be looking at what was going wrong in society, but we should be, getting young people to say their prayers and to go to church and leave it at that. And the Catholic Church at the time was undergoing a lot of change in terms of saying of itself that really it exists to make a difference in the world. And so we studied the Bible, of course, but we also studied these documents that came out of this Vatican II, and all they did was get us into a hell of a lot of trouble, really, because we took them seriously, and we trained our young people in them as well. So the lodge came about, Siavash, because we felt we would be better living together in the one house so that we could support one another. And so the lodge became, it's a big old house built in 1860 at Kalinga on the north side of Brisbane. And so we moved in there. It was empty, it wasn't being used. And so that's where we went. And I just want to say, reiterate again that some of the young people that we were dealing with in YCS and YCW, you know, came from homes where there were a lot of violence or a lot of difficulties, and our approach was to go and try and talk to parents and try and get them on side, try to help them address whatever problem was causing a lot of friction in the home. And as you would well imagine, in many instances we were quite unsuccessful. But what we would do, we'd say to some of these young people, you know, we don't know what to do. This is what we've tried, with your permission. But, you know, you can come over every second weekend and have a break from home. And we also had an Ella teen group going on a Friday night in the lodge. And so many of them joined that group. And they do their homework and they would do whatever was going on. And then they'd go home Sunday afternoon renewed, knowing that they could come back in 2 weeks' time and they'd try and do their best, whatever they could at home. So that's a little bit about the lodge. The lodge is a big old place that had 19 rooms, would you believe, 10 of which were bedrooms, and the Royal Brisbane Hospital was getting rid of a whole lot of their steel beds. So one of our friends was a welder, so we got him to make double-decker beds. And so we also turned it into a training centre for young Christian students and young Christian workers. And then these other young people that I was talking about, they could come and stay for a weekend or whatever it was that they could. Yeah, so that's what we did. So that was the lodge.
And I've heard it's very it would have been very different to youth shelters these days. It would have been quite wild and woolly back then.
Were you there?
Go on.
Were you there?
No, but I've heard a few stories. Many people who I've known through the youth sector and broader community service sector and the policy area, it seemed that one of the starting point in terms of their career was getting initiated at the lodge, and
Yeah.
various stories how back then, yeah, it wasn't basically taking young people and not really judging them and based on how they looked or their behavior and everything like that, and really being open to them.
Yeah, they were really knocked around people that we took in, and we encouraged them to be part of a community. So, you know, if they were coming past the front door and somebody knocked, well, it's their home, we'd say to them. So you make them welcome. You bring them in, you invite them to have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and anything that's going on in the house that you would like to be a part of, you're more than welcome to join in. And then we very rarely had house meetings because we encouraged everybody to be home for the evening meal. And that often turned out that people would sort of look over their day and talk about their day, and other people would comment on it. And because these young people had had so much counselling and all the rest of it, we didn't do much that was formal. Like, a lot of work got done around the kitchen table or over the washing up and drying up. And we didn't have rules. We had guidelines where we would say to young people, well, if you don't help to prepare the meal, you know, see if you can sort yourself out to help with the cleaning up. And we just did things like that. And that was good. And at the same time, we were building up trust and friendship. And some of the young people, you know, many of them were in care, and some of them would say to us, you know, how do I know you're going to be there next week? So many people have said to me, I'll be here for you. You know, I won't give up on you. I won't walk away from you. And they'd say that to us, you know, and my answer to them was keep breathing.
Mm-hmm. So that's sort of a respect and mutual respect and relationship. Obviously, is a big thing in youth work. Were there any other key learning points? Anything that you want to share with us?
There was ginormous amount of key learnings, actually. We moved into the lodge towards the end of January 1973, and about September of that year, we took on, Pat and I, that is, took on chaplaincy to a place called Wilson Youth Hospital, which later on became Wilson Youth Detention Centre. And so we took that on with our other work. And I just couldn't believe that we, in 1973, the second half of the 20th century, that we could treat young people so abysmally. There was no education. Solitary confinement was supposed to be used for 2 hours, and 2 hours only with a staff member nearby. But many of the young people were in solitary for you know, a week, 2 weeks, and some that I met had been in solitary for 1 month, and that was in 1990. Yeah, and there was no education at all. Most of the staff were untrained. One of the academics from the University of Queensland did a study on where staff came from that worked in Wilson, and his conclusion was that many of them were ex-officers, prison officers from Bogger Road, which was the main prison in Queensland at the time, and like on the girls' side, they had women that they called nurses, but they weren't nurses at all. 90% of them had no training. And then there was a lot of violence in there as well. Young people were treated violently. As I mentioned, there was no education either. The place was run by two departments, the Department of Health. So that meant that every young person was treated psychiatrically, and then the Department of Children's Services. So young people would come out of there with the double stigma of feeling that they were mad because they'd been treated psychiatrically, and bad because they'd been locked up. And many young people would say to me when they got out, you know, I never did anything wrong. I never broke the law. And why was I put in there? Why didn't I get any education? And now I'm so far behind in my education, I don't think I'll ever catch up. And it was a fierce place from that point of view. So Pat and I would discuss, you know, what we'd come across in there, and we would try and work out whatever we could to make it better. And then we'd go to the general manager, and we would talk to him about individual young people, and also about, you know, how to make the system more just and more humane. And we had a little bit of success in that area. And then Pat got transferred north, and so I took it on, and the gains that we'd made in there started to be eroded. And I felt that I couldn't work in there and equip myself to help young people, while at the same time the system was really dehumanizing them. Mm. And so that's when I started to talk about the place to anybody and everybody who would listen. And we set up the Wilson Youth Protest Group, which then became Justice for Juveniles. Whenever there was some whenever there was some adverse publicity of the place, they'd have a witch hunt in there looking for the source of information. And I'd be sitting at morning tea table with a group of prison officers, and you know, they'd be sort of saying, you know, this place is so good, it's hard to understand why anybody would ever criticize it, and who made up these lies and was telling the newspaper about them. And like, for example, the age of criminal responsibility was 8 to 16. But I came across only a couple of young people, children, who were younger than 8. I mean, and they just, I can remember names too, which I won't mention here, but they were just little kids. And here they were locked up in that place, not a clue of where they were, of what they were there for and why they were there. Yeah.
So Wally, I know that you started talking with young people themselves directly about institutional racism and system abuse. Why did you do this, and how did it impact on the young people that you were working with, that you had these chats with?
Yeah, well, Siavash, they would be talking about trying to come to grips with the fact that they felt that they were mad and bad. And I was explaining to them that the whole system is unjust and that the system has failed them. And that was a difficult thing to do because, you know, people certainly in those days didn't talk about systems change and institutional racism and things like that. And then when the light went on in their heads and they said, I get what you mean. It wasn't my fault. It was them.
Mm.
They did the wrong thing. And it was a moment of joy and a moment of freedom. And you could almost see a great weight lifted off their shoulders.
Mm.
And I would always be saying to them, hey, you know, we're trying to change that place and change the system. If you want to be part of that, we'd love to have you on board, but it's up to you. So we had young people going to university and giving a lecture, a talk on their experiences in their own homes and then in Wilson. And they'd reflected on this as well. So they were giving their own reflections as well as describing what had gone on. And so they were going to, you know, talking to psych students and social work students and secondary school students. Like I would say to young people, I'm going to be talking at this school next week. If you wish to come along and say a few words, you're more than welcome. What do you want me to say? They'd say. And I'd say, I know you've reflected on your experience. If you'd like to put some of your reflections to these young people, that'd be great. But come, and if you feel comfortable in saying something, say it. And if you don't feel comfortable, that's all right too. But this is what I'll be talking about.
Fantastic. Such an important thing that, just treating young people as you would anyone else, and actually explaining those things, and as you said, taking that weight off their shoulder. Because even today, we still have that problem of a lot of the service delivery is about getting young people to fit into the system, as opposed to actually painting the picture of what the system is and bringing them on board for as a co-activist to actually try to change the system.
Yes, I remember one lad. He wasn't the brightest of God's creatures in any way, but he was an honest young man. And we were going to see the Minister for Communities in Parliament House. So the night before, he washed and ironed his best T-shirt, of which he had 3, I think, and his best set of jeans, of which he had 2. And then he and Anne McMillan, who was a lawyer that worked with us, we go off to Parliament House. And as soon as we walk in, security just goes straight down. I think they were used to it. And like, it was just amazing, you know, who are you? What are you doing here? We'd already been through security. And it was another lot. Anyway, we got our way through that. And then we had the meeting with the minister and the Director General and an advisor. And Barry didn't say anything at all for maybe 15 minutes. And but I'd said to him, look, I know you've reflected on what's happened to you and your family. If you feel that you want to say something at any point, you just say it. But you know what the meeting's about. You know what Anne and I will be talking about. It's up to you whether you want to participate. And he did. And he participated really, really, really strongly. And a lot of people would say, oh, he's not very bright. But we do young people a great disservice when we write them off like that.
Fantastic. And I believe your work around youth justice has produced, did produce 2 governors, one governor of Queensland and one governor general of Australia. In Queensland, that was Leneen Ford, and I believe there's a story about you smuggling her in as a choir member into Wilson. Can you tell us what that was about?
Well, it's something that every youth worker ought to have in their pocket. But a lot of people, like Anne and I were, well, even Anne herself, when she first heard us talk about Wilson, you know, like so many people, they couldn't believe that what we were saying were true. But every Sunday we used to have a church service in there, and I worked out that you could actually take people in and tell the authorities that they were choir, and so Anne was a great friend of Lenine Ford's, and so Anne said, Wally can get you in on a Sunday if you'll come in. And Lenine said, absolutely, I'm happy to go in. And Anne was telling me afterwards, you know, every 2 minutes, Lenine would be pulling out her legal pad and writing in it. And Anne was like, put that away and we'll get booted out of here. I'd forgotten that story. A couple of years later, I ran into Lenine and she said, do you remember that I was part of the choir? And I said, no, I've forgotten that. And then she told me the story that I just told you. And Quentin Bryce was a law lecturer at University of Queensland, and I met her through a mate of mine who was also on the staff of the law department, and she was always available to, for example, we did a study of the juvenile justice system, and this is it, and it was published in this form in 1979, and we asked Quentin if she'd launch it. Oh, I'd be delighted, she said, and she did, and did a really good job. And at that stage, we launched her career, by the way, because she said, look, I've never launched a book before, what do I do? And it was a polished wooden floor. So she kind of knelt down and bowled the report to the other side of the room. I said, and then she said, now I think it's launched. Yes, but in that report, we looked at the police and young people, the children's court and young people, the welfare system and young people, and secure institutional care like Wilson, and then across all of that, what would be better? So it wasn't negative, it was positive. And it basically set the agenda for justice for juveniles as well.
So that was also partly, is it true that you actually did get sacked from Wilson? Was that a true story? And what was that about?
Yes, I did get sacked. One of the chaplains, there was a lot of adverse publicity regarding Wilson that was regularly hitting the papers that we had a bit to do with. And then one of the chaplains decided to write this letter to the editor of the Courier Mail saying what a marvellous place Wilson was, and that, you know, it may not be absolutely perfect, but it was so close to perfect that you wouldn't believe. And in conscience, I couldn't sign it, of course. And I didn't do my cause any good by talking two of the other chaplains out of signing it. They were going to sign it, and I talked them out of it. So I knew that I was a marked man from then on. And one of the girls who was in Wilson, she came from up north, and her mother had died, and she was at 13, was the eldest of her siblings, and her father was a mess because of the sudden death of his wife. And so she, at 13, was trying to take responsibility for the house and even help her father with his grieving while she was grieving and all the rest of it. And she asked me if I would ring him, and I did. And I had to talk to him, and he apologised over the phone and said, I expected too much of her, and I've now worked through some of my own grief, and I just want her back so that, you know, she can be with. So anyway, she ran away from Wilson and came to the lodge, and I had a good yarn with her, rang her father, put her on the bus, and gave her some money for food on the way. And then after about an hour, rang the department and said that she'd turned up at our place, and they wanted to know where she was. And I said, well, I don't really know for sure. And
aiding and abetting an escapee.
And what, sorry?
Aiding and abetting an escapee.
That's it. Yeah, that was it. And yeah, so things like that didn't endear me to the powers that be. And that's the way it was, you know, but conscience comes into play. And even though, you know, you're going to get into trouble for being conscientious about what you do, you have to, I think you have to pay that price.
That's absolutely, as youth workers, I think we have to make that decision and be very clear whose side are we really on.
Yes.
And actually act accordingly, not just in words. Fantastic. Wally, know that I've got so much more that I want to talk and ask you, but let me actually open it up to the forum and see if others want to make any statement. Anyone has any question for Wally or wants to say anything?
Well, what if they've got questions for you?
Hopefully not, but put your hand up. Use the participant icon at the bottom, and in there's a icon for putting your hand up. If you don't, I will keep asking and keep going. No. Okay. Well. Okay. We got Ben first, and then Dale. Ben, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just I wrote a little note before. I just wanted to say, you know, listening to Wally's background story, just wanted to add the comment that in my last 2 decades, you know, since entering into youth work, there has not been much change. There is still incredible resistance to system change by both government and by already, you know, entrenched service organisations. You know, it's really sad that, you know, in my experience, our state government seems to be more interested in pushing its own solutions rather than listening to community-based solutions that have proof of working.
Good point, Bern. I guess I'll put it to Wally to speak to that, because I guess, I mean, the title of this whole forum is about it can be done. And I guess Wally, I guess, has some evidence in terms of how as individual youth workers we can keep at it, and by really what we're doing actually do change some things. I mean, some stuff haven't changed, as you say, but there also has been changed, like some of those stuff that Wally was talking about. Like, thankfully, we don't have a facility like Wilson that will take naughty kids. Literally, they call like, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, and then use them as a psychiatric guinea pig and like do experiments on them and actually lock them. But Wally, do you want to talk about actually, like, in terms of whether you believe there has been change, and if there are they sort of like at the individual level, or is there anything systemic that you think has changed? And enlighten us about
the changes that that I've seen, or believe I've seen, have been, they've taken a long time, as you said, Siavash. But for example, right back in the late 70s and early 80s, we talked about closing Wilson down. Now, 4 governments over that period of 20 years or 25 years had actually made a specific date when Wilson was going to be closed. And it didn't close until the year 2000, as everybody knows, and a new place got built. So it took a long time. We did a campaign to get education into Wilson because there was none. And we had around about 400 people who said they were prepared to write letters and ring up ministers and ring their local members and stuff like that. How many of them did? I don't know. But we had some good contacts in the department who would tell us that from the letters and the phone calls that they were receiving, that it was having an influence within the department. So that campaign went on, I don't remember how long now, for several months. And they put 2 teachers in. And we were rejoicing that they had done that. But then we found out that the teachers were only doing an assessment of the young people. They weren't teaching at all. So we had another campaign to get the teachers to actually teach in there. And then that happened. Now, how long that took, I don't remember, but probably about 10 years. As I mentioned before, there was a lot of misuse, unlawful use, I would say, of solitary confinement. And we ran a campaign on that. And then I found out from my sources within the department, and later on from the Director General, that he was personally monitoring the use of solitary confinement in there. And some staff were still writing up, 2 hours in solitary confinement when they should have written 2 days or 4 days or something like that. But he was coming down on that kind of stuff. And of course he should have been doing it all the time. So, and then, like, I remember very early on in my working with young people, that we took a girl on remand at the lodge, and she said, I broke into that house because I was hungry, and Wally, I only went to the fridge and got some food. That's all I did. And I said, well, you'll get an opportunity to talk about that in court, won't you? And she said, no, we have to stand under the clock and we have to say, yes, do you plead guilty? Yes, I do. And I thought that was awful. And way back then, again, I'm talking about mid-70s, about 95% of young people who appeared in children's courts throughout Queensland were not legally represented. And that was another big thing. And I think now, like I used to work in Wilson up till about, Brisbane Youth Detention Centre up till about 10 years ago, and I couldn't shut my mouth. And when I talked to a young person, I'd say, how long have you been in? And he'd say, oh, 2 days or something or other. Have you been to court yet? No. Have you got a lawyer? And 99% of them had a lawyer. And so that was another really significant change as well. But then I set myself the task of, well, how can these young people get a voice in court? And then I picked up a book that was written by a guy called, I think, Jim Considine, a New Zealander, on restorative practices. And I read that book and I studied that book, and then there was somebody in New South Wales who was doing that, and he wrote a bit as well. And I can't remember his name now. And then, of course, in the 1990s, they started doing a pilot study of restorative practices in four places. Logan was one, Redcliffe was one, I don't remember the other two. And now that's pretty much spread throughout Queensland as well. So, and then like the really big one was Section 60 and 61 of the Children's Services Act of 1965, where it says that young people who are deemed to be uncontrollable, likely to lapse into a life of vice or crime, or who are in immoral danger, can be locked up for an indeterminate period of time. And we had to get rid of that. That's all there was to it. And again, it took years to get rid of, and we were able, it disappeared off the statute books in 1992. And but even before that, we were at Youth Advocacy Centre, we were getting invitations to talk to the magistrates when they came together for the yearly meeting. And so we could actually talk directly to the people who were putting these young people who were using Section 60 and 61. And so by about mid-1995, that section, those two sections were being used less and less. And because we had a lawyer going into Wilson and that other place at John Oxley, we knew where these young people were coming from. So that if there were 4 or 5 placed in detention under Section 60 and 61, we knew where they were coming from, and we could either get the full-time magistrate in Brisbane, a guy called Gillingwater, who came very much on side, and he would contact them and say, I see some of your young people are going in and they haven't committed an offence, you know, there's better ways of doing things and blah, 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 blah. So by the 1980s, it was being used less and less. But one of the things that disturbs me is that, well, you probably all know it, but around about 2/3 of the young people in juvenile detention are on remand, and about a half of those are remanded in custody because they're homeless. And I think that's an absolute scandal and a travesty of justice. Whatever about a waste of resources. Yeah.
Totally. And I guess I don't think any of those changes would have come by government just deciding to change. It was people like Wally and that activism being on side of young people fighting for justice. And I think, Bernd, it's I know you and your mob do great work in Gold Coast, and without any government acknowledgement and help, it's just and Wally probably can tell stories. A lot of this work that they did for many years were unfunded. The start of the lodge and start of the Youth Advocacy Centre, a lot of that work. So just I can just encourage you to keep at it. Wally is evidence that it can be done. We just have to keep banging our head, and one day eventually we'll make those changes. Dale, well, good to see you. And you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
G'day, Sivash, and hello, Wally. It's really nice to see you. Just
Yeah,
really, yeah. I just wanted to, I guess, just acknowledge. I ended up doing some work in Wilston as a music teacher, mid-90s, I think, for a few years, and then went across to John Oxley as a music teacher there. And then, as you know, went down to Logan and did that work at Centre Ed. And but what allowed me to do all that was the advocacy that you'd done previous to that. And I just wanted to sort of publicly acknowledge that pathway you created for others is really significant. And I went on to, as you know, create a lot of schools across the country for young people who are outside education, and now are working for Life Without Barriers for the couple of thousand kids they have in care, trying to lift their education outcomes across Australia. All of that career, that pathway for myself, that sort of vocation was the gates were opened to that by the work you'd done in those earlier years. And I just really wanted to say thanks for that. My final question or comment, but I'll have to jump out of this because I've got another meeting to go to, but is, and you mentioned it earlier, Wally, this sort of care pathway to prison that we've got in this country seems to be not changing that much. If you enter into, particularly those young people that end up in resi care, the pathway out of that's really complex, and we're certainly seeing a lot of that in the work I'm doing at the moment. Maybe the next forum is we can have a yarn about how we start turning some of that around. So thanks, Wally. And thanks,
Dale, and thank you for the great work you're doing too. It's good that people are around with the light.
Lights on.
Lights on, yeah.
Any other questions, comments from anyone? Please put your hand up. While we're waiting, Wally, can I ask you about Babby, the Bayside accommodation? Was it Bayside boarding accommodation? What was Babby's history? You started that as well.
Yeah. When I was living at the lodge, we banned TV from the place because it just used to make young people depressed, and you'd have to spend hours helping them get on top of their depression. I thought, oh, this is bloody stupid. But we had opportunities to talk with people, as I mentioned earlier, in the kitchen over a cuppa while you're doing the washing up. We had 3 lounges in the place, and so you could have an impromptu kind of meeting, and I was always keen to listen and listen again to the stories, and I came to the conclusion that that a lot of this suffering that these young people had gone through and were going through, and even a lot of the suffering that their parents or carers were going through needn't happen, that there could be prevention and early intervention that could shortcut all of that. And so there was an opportunity to talk at there was a youth group down there, and they wanted me to come and talk about the lodge and talk about Youth Advocacy Centre, which was up and running at that time. And I said, no, I wasn't interested in talking about that. And they said, well, what do you want to talk about? They want to talk about the problems of homeless young people in Wynnum Manly. And they said, but we don't have any homeless people down here. I said, you do. And because I could remember the stories of two brothers who were in Wilson who came from that area, and they were able to get away from Wilson a couple of times, and they always went back down there, and so the police would pick them up and return them to Wilson. And so at this talk, about 70 was made open to the public, and about 70 people turned up, and by this time I'd actually done 2 or 3 days work down there. So I went and saw, you know, the guy in charge, the social worker in charge of Centrelink, and I'd heard that he was very interested in young people and wanted to do something. I had to talk to the boss of the department. I heard the Children's Services Department was really good, and I went and made an appointment and saw him. And I went and saw the head of Juvenile Aid Bureau, and in a very short space of time, I got a picture of what was going on. And I found out that they were exporting around about 30 young people every month to Brisbane. And there was nothing available in Brisbane. Pindari, some of the young girls got to Pindari. Many, many young people ended up in boarding houses where there were heaps and heaps of people who had alcohol and or drug problems. So I get up and talk about this at the meeting, and people got quite upset and said, this doesn't happen down here. And I said, well, you know, there's Sergeant so-and-so from the police, and he told me that, so maybe you could direct your questions to him. And that's what we did. And by the end of it, I was saying, you know, you've got some options. You can do nothing, or you can do something. And here's 3 somethings that maybe you might think about. And if you decide to do any one of these 3, I'll work with you for a couple of years to help you do this. And I've done a bit of study in community development at U of Q. So that also helped me as well. So that was how Babby got underway. But and of course the justice thing was very much part of the training that we put into these families. And one Monday morning I arrived at the office at Youth Advocacy, and I get a phone call from the coordinator of Babby. And she said, where were you on the weekend? And I said, I was busy. What were you doing? And anyway, I told her what I was doing, and things settled down. And then I said, what happened over the weekend? And she said, well, you remember so-and-so, one of the girls who's in their group? And I said, yeah, I do. She said, well, the family that she's with, their daughter is into horse riding. So the 2 of them went horse riding at the back of Manly, and a police car came along and thought he recognised one of the girls that they wanted to question or whatever. So put his siren on, and both horses bolted, and one of the girls ended up under the wheels of the police car. And I said, what happened then? They said, well, we were contacted. And so we, made sure the girls were okay and they were knocked around and in shock and all the rest of it, but no broken bones and some gravel rash. And then we decided this wasn't good enough. So myself and one of the other people in the group, we went around to the police station and we demanded to see whoever was in charge that Sunday afternoon. And we said, we are trying to train our young people from this area to be responsible. How about you start training your men to be responsible too? And then they went back on the Monday morning as well and had another go. And so that brought joy to this old heart. So does that answer the question adequately?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the history of Baby. And there's so many organizations that if I keep asking, Wally will spend at least a couple of weeks here talking about how he started Youth Advocacy Centre, the Brisbane Youth Service. But I just want to put a thought to you people who are online of whether you can basically think about social justice issues that your young people you're working with are identifying with. What are the social justice issues that are hot topic today, and what you think could be done about them, and whether you want to ask Wally anything about what he thinks it could be done about them. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. And meanwhile, I'll come back to you, Wally, and could you tell us a little bit about your involvement with Zigzag?
Yeah, Zigzag, I
and maybe tell people what Zigzag is and how.
Yeah, Zigzag is a young women's accommodation and counselling service that's been going since the mid-80s, I'd say, and mid-80s. And I had finished up at Youth Advocacy Centre, but I was available to do a couple of days a week there. And I'd had annual holidays and I came back, and two of the workers whom I knew really well, they're absolutely brilliant people. I said, what have you been doing this last month while I've been away? And they said, we're going to set up a service for young women. And I said, what kind of a service? And they said, accommodation. And I said, what's the idea of that and what needs is it going to fulfill and all the rest of it? And very politely, I said to them, I think we can do better. And I said, if you'd let me come up with a model, I'm happy to do it. And they said, oh yeah, that'd be great. And again, because, I'd listened to quite a few young women who'd been homeless and on the streets and all the rest of it, I was able to come up with this model, and these two workers from Youth Advocacy Centre said, well, we have a group of 20 women youth workers that comes together, and so would you present it to them? And I said, no way. I said, if you want it sunk, that's the best way to do it. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, a male presenting a model to help young women to a group of women workers, not going to work. And I said, and then I've got the added problem of being a Catholic priest as well. So I'll do a summary of it and you two present it, if you will. And I said, I'd really like feedback from the youth workers, and I will be seeking feedback from young women who've been homeless themselves. So that's how Zigzag got itself off the ground. Yeah, but sadly, you know, governments would say, oh yes, we could fund this bit, but this other bit's not within our guidelines. And if they said that to me, I'd say, yeah, but you know that the need is spot on that I've written about and that I've incorporated into this model. So it's terribly important that you change your funding criteria and include this, because you know that it's my non-directive stuff. Yeah. So so that's how Zigzag got itself off the ground. And yeah, and it brings joy to my heart when I drive out past Camp Hill and know that good people are doing good things for lots of people.
Thank you. So anybody wants to talk about what's going on today with young people, any social justice issues that you want to talk about, or any other questions from Wally? Please put your hand up if you do so want to speak. Go ahead, Wally. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, it's just one thing I want to say is that a lot of people felt that I and Justice for Juveniles was against the department and against the workers of the department. We worked really, really well with good workers, and a number of senior workers approached us individually and would say, you know, it's great work that you're doing, but in the department, we can't do anything at all. And I would say to them, you know, you can't get away with that. You know, there are at least another 2 people on your floor in the building you are in who think the same way as you. You need to find them and you need to come together and support one another, and you need to look at what can we do to make the systems that we administrate better systems. And that was good. And when we were doing campaigns like for education in Wilson or whatever, you know, you get phone calls from these people in the department and saying, look, I'm not ringing from my office, I'm ringing from a public phone. I just want to tell you that the campaign is having an effect, blah, 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 blah. And like I used to give a lot of public lectures about the juvenile justice system. And I remember saying that from what I could work out, about 50% of young people who are in juvenile detention were Indigenous. I get a phone call this day from this very senior lady whom I'd never met. And she said, I'd like to talk to you privately. And I said, oh, great, I'll come to your office. No, don't come to my office. She said, but do you know anywhere discreet where I could talk with you? And I said, yeah, I do. So we met up at this coffee place that was discreet, or I thought it was discreet anyway. And I said, what do you want to talk about? And she said, you've been saying in public lectures that 50% of people in detention, juvenile detention, are Indigenous. And I said, yeah, but I've been saying that I don't know the figures for sure, but anecdotally, that's what it seems to me and from my observation. She said, we've been keeping stats on that. And I said, but that's against government policy. Yeah, but we're doing it. We've been able to do it, and we'll do it until we get stopped. And she said, if you mention the figure 75%, you'd be closer to the mark. So what I'm saying there is that there are good people of conscience working in the departments, and they need to be given a bit of hope that we must make sure that they don't let themselves off the hook either. That they've got to do what they can do to make the system more just and more humane.
Good point, Wally. Very good point. And if I was to ask you, what are, like, a few points that you would suggest are the best ways in terms of engaging and building kind of a relationship with those young people that are really marginalized? What would they be? Like, how do you actually get to know those young people and be able to work with them?
It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of, sometimes it takes a hell of a lot of abuse as well, because some young people will say to you after a while, so many people have let me down that when I meet somebody new, I give them a hard time to see what they're made of. So you have to be prepared to put up with abuse, and you have to be, and then the building of a relationship is slow. But one of the things that I found is key, that you do for that young person what you promise you will do. And that is really, really, really key. They have been let down so many times by so many people that it's valid that they don't trust adults. And so the building up of trust takes a long time. And that's that mutual and respectful relationship stuff. And the listening is really, really important. And then the doing consistently is vitally important as well. And then if you've got a few tricks up your sleeve, like the See Judge Act stuff, or the reality therapy, or 12-step program that you can put at the service of these young people, then you can be doing them a service that's going to benefit them for life.
Thank you, Wally. And early on in the introduction, I mentioned your sense of humor. And I guess I just want to ask you whether you think in this line of work with, as you said, where you have to actually, in terms of trying to build trusting relationship, you go through abuse, you bang your head against wall with so much going around and around, whether actually having a sense of humor is necessary in terms of nurturing yourself, self-care, and to be a long-term work in the sector?
Yeah, I think a sense of humour is vital. It's one of the things that I'm grateful that, even though my sense of humour is perverse, and I publicly acknowledge that, I think it's vitally, vitally important. And I think the other thing that goes with it is, whenever you have an opportunity to celebrate anything with the young people, with the young person, do it. It might be a birthday, it might be, that they've been shortlisted for a job, whatever it is. It might be that they've done an assignment and got it in. But to celebrate achievements, small as they are, is vitally important. Yeah.
Very good point. And I'm going to share my desktop with people now, which are these dot points that Wally, you sent me. They're called Reflections on Excelling. And you've got a story about that. I'll put that up, and I would appreciate if you tell us the story behind these points, that I think it's very important.
Yeah, I was down having dinner with friends of mine at their place, and after dinner, I was watching a little bit of TV in the lounge, and the youngest, who was 10 at the time, came in and she said, "Can I disturb you?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. What's up?" And she said, "I have to do an assignment, a speaking assignment on social justice. And Daddy said it'd be good to talk to you." And that sort of blew me out of my tree, because when I was 10, I wouldn't have had a clue what social justice was. Anyway, I said, "Do you have any questions?" And she said, "Yes, I've got a few questions written out." So she spoke those questions, but they didn't go anywhere. And I said to her, "How would it be if I told you a real story about social justice?" And she said, "Yeah, that'd be good." So she sat on the lounge chair, and I told her one of the stories about Wilson, and she had a pen and a piece of paper, but she never wrote anything down at all. And when I finished talking, she said, "That's exactly what I was looking for." And off she went. And then the following Wednesday, I got a phone call from her, and I said, "Have you done your speaking assignment yet?" She said, "No, that's what I want to talk to you about." And I said, "What do you want to talk about?" And she said, "I know you're really busy, but would you come to my school on Friday afternoon, and then after I've finished my speaking assignment, would you then be my live prop and answer questions from my class?" So I said, "Yeah." So she had about 5 or 6 PowerPoints, and the last PowerPoint was this one that Siavash has got up on reflection on excelling. Excelling is caring more than others think is wise, risking more than others think is safe, dreaming more than others think is practical, and expecting more than others think is possible. So I've now got live prop on my CV.
Such words of wisdom. I love them. Love it. Okay, so I'll stop sharing my screen. Were there any comments, any questions? We're coming towards the end of the session. This is your last chance. You can, well, it's not quite your last chance. I'll be sending a survey. You can also talk in that one if there's things that you want to say that you don't want to do it publicly here. Wally, was there anything else that you wanted to raise with the group? Any suggestions, any words of advice in terms of how to carry on this line of work around justice?
I don't think there is, except you know, one of the things I mentioned was going with Barry to Parliament House, and the voices of the young people that we're working with, those voices need to be heard. And I think we need to encourage those young people. I think it does them the world of good too, if they can be given a voice, given the opportunity to talk about how they see the things that they're concerned about.
Great, great, Molly. And there is definitely a question in the survey in terms of whether people do want to hear for us basically having another forum, and so you can hear directly from both young people now or ex-young people with lived experience, or those who have been working to change the youth justice system. Please fill up that survey and let us know if you think that's worthwhile. We're coming to 12 o'clock, so I'd like to wrap up this session by thanking everyone for participating, giving your time. Thank you again, Wally, for not only giving your time to us today, but for everything that you have done for the youth sector and more importantly for young people in Queensland. We salute you and draw inspiration from you and as a person and your ongoing struggle for achieving social justice. It's just has empowered so many people, and your impact is immense. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Wally. And unless there's anything else, I'll close the session.
And thank you, Siavash, and thank you too for all the youth workers who are doing sterling work across this state. You need to be very proud of yourself and stand tall.
Thanks, Wally. Thanks, Siavash.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah, see you, Lorraine.
See you, Wally.
See you all. Have a nice rest of the day. Enjoy and see you next time. Bye-bye.